Welcome back to Truth or Foil. Today we're going to be going over the Haarp Weather Facility. I'm going to give you some of the science behind it, some of the conspiracies, and then it's also at the top of the conspiracy theories hit list, along with the moon landing, chemtrails, and in terms of how well known they are, it's one of the most well known. Regardless of what you end up thinking about the conspiracies, the science behind the Haarp facility is really interesting. So let's go ahead and talk about Haarp, and we'll go ahead and cover why it's controversial and the conspiracies around it. Many of the theories that come from Haarp come from people who think that it just has an outright control of the weather. And they not just control it, but they can control it to such a degree that they cause earthquakes, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, and they can even knock planes out of the air mid-flight. There are even some theories that say that they can disrupt communications on a global scale, and some that even say that they can influence the minds and moods of human beings. It may seem outrageous, but I'm trying to be objective. I want to evaluate the science behind the claims. I want to evaluate, the science that would deny the claims, and then we'll come to a conclusion based on what we find. It would also seem to me that on the base surface, just as a note, that if they had this amount of power, it would be hidden behind a lot of classified documents and very heavily protected by the military. But Haarp isn't even funded by the government anymore, and it's entirely unclassified. So there's a little bit of doubt to me right away that they have this kind of power, but maybe it's a hide in plain sight kind of thing. Like I said, they actually are no longer funded by the military, and the University of Alaska took over the project entirely. And when they were bought out, I think in 2014, they ended up upgrading their array to 12 by 15, but they kept the power consumption and the megahertz output the same. Let's go ahead and talk a bit about what Haarp was made to do, what it was created for. So Haarp was basically made to study the ionosphere and the ionosphere's interaction with space weather, and how all of this space weather and the ionosphere affects the communications on Earth in terms of radio communications and GPS signals. So the array itself generates what's called a VLF and an ELF signal. VLF stands for very low frequency radio wave, and ELF stands for extremely low frequency radio wave. These radio waves travel around the world. They penetrate into the ocean so that they can communicate with submarines. They travel into the ground to somewhat reveal hidden structures. That one's a little up for debate on whether they're fully capable of actually doing that. And basically, they look for points where the radio waves start to reflect off of things in the ground in an odd pattern, in a different way than they would be used to in that area, and they consider that abnormality as something they've discovered, and they go look into it. Haarp is really involved in a lot of complex science, and I'm going to have to try to explain it, and in order to explain it, I'm going to have to break down every bit and piece little by little, so it's going to take a lot of effort, but just stay with me, and hopefully you get a better understanding of how Haarp works. So the first principle that I want to explain is the core of Haarp, the core of its goals, really. When it comes to interacting with the ionosphere, Their goal is to create an interaction that functions almost the same way that the sun does. So the way that works is the sun basically expels energy in the form of photons. The photons that come towards Earth from the sun collide with our upper atmosphere, which is our ionosphere. And Haarp's goal is basically to be able to replicate the effect that the sun has on our ionosphere, but in a more controlled, focused, and repeatable way that they hope to do using long wavelength, low frequency radio waves. So to explain a bit more about that, I need to explain a bit more about the ionosphere itself. The ionosphere is a constantly fluctuating layer of the Earth's atmosphere, ranging from 50 kilometers to about 1,000 kilometers in altitude. It's the final layer of our atmosphere before space, and the layer is thin in a sense. It's definitely thinner than the other layers of our atmosphere. It's so thin that the sun's ultraviolet lights and X-rays, which is the type of energy, the type of photon they're sending out, it can reach it, but it's also dense enough, thick enough to absorb these different kinds of rays, and then it ionizes the gases in the ionosphere. Okay, so to give a little bit more information on that, we basically live in an area of the atmosphere that is referred to as the troposphere. This is about 80% of the Earth's atmosphere in terms of density. And it's where all of our weather happens, which the altitude of the troposphere ranges between 6 to 20 kilometers in altitude, from where we live up to 20 kilometers in altitude. So to elaborate on the ionization of the ionosphere, ionization is the process where high energy radiation strips away the electrons from a neutral atom or molecule, which creates a negatively charged electron and a positively charged ion. Now, ion is just a charged radioactive particle, which means it has a positive charge. Which is just basically an atom missing an electron. The influence of our sun, basically the photons hitting our atmosphere, causes most of the ionosphere to basically be active all the time, which means that these atoms and molecules are constantly gaining and losing electrons, creating a shell of charged particles around the Earth, which is where the ionosphere comes from. This process that strips away these electrons also releases energy in the form of heat and light, so more photons. This light is referred to as air glow, and it's very similar to how the aurora borealis lights look and how they function, that formed in the polar regions. However, this effect you can see in the night sky everywhere on Earth. It can be difficult to see without the right conditions. And basically the conditions are, it needs to be a dark night, or you need to have a really sensitive camera, or you need to be somewhere that has no light pollution. I personally have seen this kind of lighting when I went to the Daniel Boone National Forest in Tennessee. It was really pretty. There was no light pollution, really clear sky. I went there actually to go see the solar eclipse a few years ago, and it was beautiful. It was really nice. Tangents aside, so normally in the denser parts of our atmosphere, like the troposphere, the negative electrons and positive ions, they recombine really quickly because they're so tightly packed together, right? So because our ionosphere is so much less dense, and the further up you go, the less dense it is, they are really far apart, so it takes longer for them to recombine. Because of all these free electrons that are floating around in space, the upper atmosphere, our ionosphere, becomes conductive, starting at about 50 kilometers in altitude. It hits about peak conductivity at about 300 kilometers, and at the top of the ionosphere, around 1,000 kilometers in altitude, it has basically no conductivity left, because the vacuum of space starts influencing it, because, like I said, it's the final layer. So at that altitude, the ionosphere basically isn't thick enough to keep conductive particles in, and space starts taking over, so it loses conductivity at about that height. Because of how many variables there are in the ionosphere and how constantly changing it is, the ionosphere actually is designated with 3 different layers. The layers are referred to as Layer D, Layer E, and Layer F. Don't know why they started at D, E, and F. Maybe troposphere, stratosphere, magnetosphere. So A, B, C? Maybe. So layer D is basically the lowest altitude, E is obviously in the middle, and F is the highest altitude, right? Because of the layers being conductive, they end up interacting with the electromagnetic waves like radio broadcasts that we end up sending from Earth, which is, again, why Haarp was interested in it, why the military was interested in it. I'll get more into that later, though. Depending on the frequency of the waves, some frequencies can be absorbed by different parts of the atmosphere, right? So some of the waves will end up passing right through without any resistance, just based on their frequency. Other frequencies can be reflected off of the electron layer, or atmospheric shrapnel is what it's technically called when they're free-floating electrons. And some of them will be absorbed. Because these effects are caused by the influence of the sun, they will dramatically change based on whether or not it's day or night, summer or winter. And in fact, the ionospheric layer D only exists during the daytime. It disappears entirely at night, which I think that's actually really cool. It's interesting at the least. This means that abnormal solar activity, like solar flares, also causes abnormal activity in the ionosphere. Causes drastic effects on the radio transmissions. So all of that being said, I want to get into Haarp a little bit more in terms of what their capabilities are on a strictly science basis. So Haarp uses 1 to 3.6 megawatts of high-frequency radio signals in a 2 to 10 megahertz range to basically excite the gas molecules and the atoms in the ionosphere that are directly above in a 30-degree area above the facility, right? It does so using this tool. They call it a tool. It's basically the array that they have of the facility. It's called an IRI, or Ionospheric Research Instrument, which is, again, the antenna array that I was referring to, that is now a 12 by 15 instead of the 6 by 8. So 180 antenna. This is the device that when people are talking about the heater at the facility, this is what they mean. Because by exciting the electrons in the gases and stuff like that up in the ionosphere, they are causing a heating effect. It's very slight, but they're causing a heating effect, so it's called the heater. So for small comparison, the 6 by 8 antenna array was only 48 antenna. The 12 by 15 is 180, so they upgraded pretty drastically. You hear 6 and 8 compared to 12 and 15, it doesn't really sound that drastic, but I mean, it's more than twice as many just based on how many antennae are actually there. On top of that, they're covering 24 acres of land, which is a pretty large space. It's not that insane, but I mean that's a pretty big space just to have antenna on. This antenna array functions as basically a massive transmitter, and it electronically emits and steers a beam over the 30-degree angle I was referring to through the ionosphere. The area that this beam affects is about 60 to 120 square kilometers, and they can shoot it between, well, roughly 150 to 250 kilometers in altitude, and it really varies on how much power they're giving it, the frequency, and the configuration they decide to use for the broadcast, right? By moving this beam around small patches of the ionosphere, it causes a heating effect, which again is why it's called the heater. This is done to create a signal that we were talking about before, the VLF and ELF waves. These are the signals I'm referring to when I'm saying they're broadcasting a signal at a certain frequency. Because VLF, very low frequency. ELF, extremely low frequency. One of the main things that people point out when they start looking at HAARP and the conspiracy theories that surround it, the energy output of the facility. There's a lot of misconstrued information about this, so I'm going to give you the absolute specific facts on what I found for this, okay? So the facility's power output is maxed out when they hit 3.6 megawatts. However, the reason why people get confused on this is they end up seeing a second number when they go to look up the facility that says that they have a effective radiated power of 5.1 gigawatts. Basically, 5.1 gigawatts is a lot more power, which means it would be capable of doing a lot more heating than they originally said. But the important thing to note here is that it's the effective radiated power, or ERP is what it's called, which is not the same as normal power, so I'm going to elaborate on that. This is basically where people misunderstand what they're capable of. So in the broadcast industry, they have a figure called an ERP, right? This is effective radiated power. This figure is referring to something that broadcast engineers in that industry use as basically a figure to understand the capabilities of the broadcast signal. Okay, this figure actually refers to something that engineers in the broadcast industry use as a baseline to understand how much power would actually be needed if there was no focus on the broadcast signal. So if they wanted to affect the entire sky at the same time. HAARP, however, uses a focused beam, as I previously stated, which only can use up to 3.1 or 3.6 megawatts, and the ERP figure is just a fictional number that they use as a guideline. So it just helps them basically measure the output of the actual beam. It is not what the signal can actually put out. So the tighter the area of effect is for the broadcast signal, the higher the ERP would be, because it would take more power to broadcast at that same strength across the entire sky. Okay? This would basically be... This is a good point for me to actually say that there's no physical way that they could turn 3.6 megawatts into 5.1 gigawatts because that would break the laws of physics. You simply can't get even an extra watt of power because of the law of conservation of energy. You can't create or destroy energy. So whatever you put in is what you can get out. There's conversions of energy, but they couldn't convert it to gain watts. You would only be able to lose wattage. So no matter what, they can only produce 3.6 megawatts, which that's another pretty big hit to this conspiracy theory so far. Basically, as the signal from their broadcast travels to the ionosphere, energy is being absorbed and dispersed into particles along the entire path. And by the time it even reaches the ionosphere, it's all the way down to 36 milliwatts, which is 36 thousandths of a watt. But for comparison, the amount of energy that the sun hits a single square kilometer of the ionosphere with, during the daytime specifically, is about 1,367 watts, which is almost 37,000 times more energy than Haarp is capable of producing. And it's exact measurement, like comparatively in 1 square kilometer compared to the other square kilometer, they are not even close to matched up. The sun beats them out entirely. It would be, for just kind of a nonsense comparison, it'd be like trying to melt a massive, like, 100-mile glacier with a space heater. You're just not going to get anywhere with it. So I kind of want to give a little bit more perspective, just so people have a better understanding of what Haarp is really capable of and why the power ideas that they have is just outrageous. So 5.1 gigawatts is actually more than all of Alaska combined would be able to supply. That much power would have to be pretty nearby, or the infrastructure to support that amount of power would be all over the place. It'd be very, very, very obvious that they are receiving tremendous amounts of power. But you can look at any satellite image all around them. It's not a classified area. You can look at them as much as you want. They have no facilities like that near them. They're kind of just in the middle of nowhere by themselves. Especially, they don't have any facility like that. So Haarp actually does have a picture of the power that they use and how they use it. It's actually 5 diesel-powered generators on site. It's in their basement. They literally have just 5 diesel generators. I want to cover another topic that kind of brings more validity to the conspiracy. It's what most of the people that believe in the conspiracy would refer to when they would talk about, you know, what's true and what's false of it. So basically, in the 1960s and 1970s, 1980s, one of the main people that were involved in the conception of Haarp, he filed a patent that gave people a lot of ideas for the conspiracy theories, but originally they were supposed to be ideas to help the U.S. military, right? His name is Bernard J. Eastland. So let's go back before the founding of Haarp. I want to talk a little bit about this oil and gas company that was called Atlantic Richfield, and they were known as ARCO. So ARCO had the rights to the natural gas field in northern Alaska and basically the northern slope region. However, because it was so far away from pretty much anyone that would pay for it, and travel, you know, moving it was very inefficient at the time, they didn't know what to do with all this natural gas and stuff. It cost too much to move it, and it basically made it financially not worth moving. So Bernard Eastland was a MIT trained physicist, and he worked for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission in the 1960s up to the beginning of 1970s, and his specialty was plasma physics. And he co-developed something called a fusion torch, which is actually just a method of using high temperature plasma of a nuclear reactor to convert waste materials that would just be thrown out otherwise into reusable elements. So it's pretty impressive. In the 1980s, Bernard was working for ARCO, and he became president of ARCO's production technologies company in Houston, Texas. He had an idea that ARCO could use the massive amount of natural gas reserves in Alaska to basically power this huge antenna complex to focus high energy radio waves into the ionosphere. So obviously that probably sounds familiar to you, because that's kind of what we are talking about this whole time. This would basically heat up the gas atoms in the ionosphere to create artificial plasma layers, but it would be done in a way that he could control, move, and shape based on the equipment he had on the ground. Alaska also would be in a great position because the Earth's magnetic field lines go almost vertically up and down in the spot that he wanted to build, which was right next to the natural gas. Seems great in theory. Each antenna would basically then create a circular polarized radio beam, which would spin particles around the magnetic field line I was talking about at the same resonant frequency as the ions. This effect is called a cyclotron, and it's used to accelerate particles very, very, very fast, which would obviously cause heating, which would cause the plasma. Heating up the plasma would allow it to move along magnetic lines to higher altitudes than they could before, basically using that energy to push it through. This idea ended up as a patent that was granted to him by the US in 1987. The title is really vague, but it was in fact patented. The title for it is Method and Apparatus for Altering a Region in the Earth's Atmosphere, Ionosphere, or Magnetosphere. However, Bernard had filed this patent while he was working for ARCO, which they ended up claiming the patent as their own. Not long after that, Bernard ended up cutting ties with ARCO. He left, and he set up his own research company because he didn't want to give them credit anymore, or at least I assume. When we look at the patent further, we can see where a lot of conspiracy theories actually come from. In the patent, he claimed that the antenna array would be able to disrupt global communications. Just outright, all global communications could be interfered with. It also claimed that he could interfere with satellite signals, with missiles, with aircraft, and with sea crafts. Basically by modulating the different areas of the ionosphere, which is what they rely on to propagate and extend radio signals all around the Earth. He basically believed that he could interfere with anything just by altering the ionosphere. He also believed all of this was possible due to the tests that the US and the Soviet Union actually conducted in the 1950s and 1960s, where they exploded nuclear weapons in the magnetosphere of the Earth. They actually discovered that when they blew these nuclear weapons up in the magnetosphere, the particles that were charged by the superheated explosion ended up traveling along the magnetic field lines in a spiral motion that ended up bouncing back and forth between the mirror points, which is just basically the endpoints for the magnetic line. This created a massive amount of radio interference, right, to such a degree that it even blinded radar systems. And they thought they would be able to create basically enough interference to even stop nuclear missiles from working right. Using a nuke to interfere with other nukes, it's wild. This basically leads to some of the other patent claims. That you could create a layer of plasma, superheated particles, in that magnetic field line in two different positions, and then trap particles between them that would basically bounce back and forth really, really quickly and create a similar effect to the nuclear explosion tests. The patent also claims that you could heat areas of the plasma along the magnetic field line to increase their altitude, and then you could move them in position to interfere with missiles and satellites to cause unpredictable travel, more drag on them to slow them down. The patent also claimed that he could modify the weather with this device. By basically affecting the upper atmosphere's wind patterns, he would be able to use the antenna array to fluctuate the plasma to almost like a plume that would focus particles like a lens and concentrate solar energy. And it would do so in a way that would end up heating it and altering the course of a jet stream to move different weather patterns like hurricanes and to create droughts in areas. Patton also claimed to be able to create reflectors in the sky that would be able to redirect ELF signals to a depth of about 1 kilometer or so, which after a satellite would pick up the signal, they could use it to find hidden structures, which is where that idea comes from. And it almost acts in the same way that a CAT scan works. So in theory, it works. I'm not 100%. I couldn't find anything on whether or not that aspect of it works. But in theory, because of the way CAT scan works, that should work. He also claimed that he wanted to use ELF waves because the human brain functions in a range of 3 to 12 hertz. So basically he suggested that if you aim this wave at an enemy, you could alter their mood and their ability to operate. The ELF wave operates on a 2 to 10 hertz frequency, so that was his thought, is it's within range of the brain's frequency, so you could alter it. Another idea that he claimed was possible in the patent was being able to alter the molecular makeup of the upper atmosphere and to increase levels of ozone to fix the ozone hole, right? And basically to break down some of the other chemicals that are in the air that we don't really want, like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxide. All these claims, to me, a lot of these claims are over the top and they seem exaggerated, but ARCO still really liked some of the ideas, so they are the ones that actually sent the patent over, and they sent it to someone named Simon Ramo. He was a lead developer of microwave technologies, missile technologies, and he also was one of the creators of the ICBMs, which is intercontinental ballistic missiles. He basically sent the ideas to the U.S. Defense Department, who then sent it to DARPA. So basically he acted as a middleman who got the message through to people who'd be able to actually help get it patented. Alright, so now, before we close this out, I kind of want to talk about some of the flaws in these proposed ideas. The first of which is the power output. So basically, there's a term called true power output, which is the absolute minimal amount of power needed to cause something to function in the way that it is being theorized. So his theories, after being evaluated by engineers and scientists who would be able to create such devices, they said that it would need a true power output of a bare minimum of 100 gigawatts, and at the time specifically, it's an impossible task. And even now, you would need many facilities to create that much power. It would be insane, and it would be so obvious that there's a group of power structures, like the strongest one I believe is a Russia-based one that's like 5.8 gigawatts, and it's a massive facility. True power, like I said, it refers to the actual capabilities, like what it would actually take to create the function that they would want to the degree that they would want. It's not the ERP figure, this is the literal figure. Alright, so that's, for perspective, that's 28,000 times more powerful than the 3.6 megawatts that Haarp currently can do. Then you also need to look at the amount of antennas that it would take for this. So practically, like what is practical to use, they use 20 kilowatt antennas for the entire array right now. Using that same figure, it would take more than 5 million antennas of that same power to create this effect. And it would take up 51 square kilometers, which is just an enormous amount of space. So if you didn't notice the power lines or the power grid that was created to support this, there's no way that you would miss 5 million antenna. And even if they use the highest end antenna, which is 100 kilowatt, they would still need more than 1 million. So there's just no way that they could hide this. Specifically, it's very obvious that this is not what Haarp is capable of. So that puts a whole shadow of a doubt on all of it. However, all of this being said, this is exactly why Bernard suggested that they should use the area in Alaska. They had a ton of natural gas that they didn't know what to do with, and a ton of space to use, and it was on the magnetic line. Arco simply didn't have the ability to convert all of that natural gas to that much power in any feasible way, and Bernard's ideas simply were too big. They were too much. There was no way that anyone could create this. He was basically thinking in a purely theoretical sense and not in a practical sense. However, the whole reason this even got patented and people were so interested in it, DARPA and the military, they were interested in this for a good reason. They basically saw an opportunity to take all of these ideas, take the location, and to create a much, much, much smaller facility that would allow them to test some of the ideas that he had on a much smaller scale and determine if there was any validity to them and then scale them up if there was. They basically determined that the original location that Bernard wanted to build was an actual good one, considering all the circumstances, and they wanted to be able to tap into what's called the auroral electrojet, which is basically just the electric current that circulates in the polar regions of the ionosphere, which lines up right where they ended up building. Basically, by modulating the auroral electrojet with the ELF wave, it would create a virtual antenna effect in the ionosphere that would basically allow them to reflect and transmit VLF and ELF signals very, very, very far. This is why the US Navy and DARPA were all very interested in this and why they ended up pushing the patent through. All of that being said, you could see where people would get confused or where they would get the ideas that Haarp is capable of just outrageous things. However, what Haarp is and what the original patent says it should have been are completely different. Haarp is like 10,000 times smaller than what Bernard wanted it to be. And Haarp doesn't even operate at all times. It only operates in very short bursts throughout the years, and it uses radio waves instead of microwaves to energize atmospheric gas in the ionosphere. Some people have this idea that it operates like a giant microwave and is cooking everything in it, but that's just not how it works. I'll kind of explain a little bit about that real quick. So, the operating frequency determines what kind of wave it is. So, for example, the frequency of a microwave is 2.45 gigahertz, right? So, where we look at the frequency of radio waves that Haarp uses, it's only 2 to 10 megahertz, right? So, megahertz is not gigahertz. The frequency of the microwave is far more powerful, which would cause a heating effect. But as I've explained, Haarp nowhere near capable of doing that. So the main thing that Haarp has actually accomplished is they've created airglow effects by doing minor heating in the ionosphere, very, very slight heating, nothing like global warming or creating natural disasters, none of that. They have learned to harness ELF signals and VLF signals and to fire them into the upper atmosphere to extend the range. Some people look at that and they say, oh, that's proof of concept, Bernard's ideas work. But people don't have a good perspective on what it takes to actually scale these ideas to the maximum, to what it would actually take to create Bernard's effects. We just don't have the ability to do it, and we most certainly wouldn't have the ability to hide it. It would be very, very obvious to everyone on the planet if they were doing it. So, let's go ahead and talk about the Alright, so let's just call it truth or foil for this entire conspiracy theory, right? I'm not a scientist. I just want to clarify that my understanding of everything I've read here, it's a loose understanding. To me, it seems obvious enough that there is plenty of evidence to the contrary that this is a functional thing. At the very least, it's not what Haarp is capable of. The fundamental flaws to the conspiracy theory, like the inability to power it, the inability to have enough antenna to create the array that would be used to create a high enough frequency to cause any drastic effects, none of it adds up to them altering the weather, much less causing natural disasters. Right? So it just seems fundamentally impossible for Haarp to create any of this. So I'm calling the current conspiracy theory that Haarp alters the weather complete foil. No doubt in my mind that it is foil. I'm also calling the natural disaster part obviously foil. That was nonsense from the beginning, but I tried to keep an open mind and read about it, and after reading about it, it's definitely nonsense. However, I want to kind of elaborate and maybe even start a conspiracy theory of my own. So, first off, the power required to cause any of the drastic effects that the patent was referring to are impossible for the Haarp facility. And if they had a way to do it, you would know. There'd be tons of satellite images of Haarp, or there is tons of satellite images of Haarp, and it's not classified. You can look all of this stuff up. They're not hiding anything, at least not obviously. If they constructed a power grid or the antenna, everybody would see it. There'd be no way they could hide it. The real problem is that Haarp is just too small a facility to do any of the grandiose effects that Bernard had in mind. All of his ideas in the patent, besides extending VLF and ELF waves, are still completely unproven ideas. In theory, however, they should work. The Haarp facility isn't capable of doing what people think it is. I do think that there is some validity to what he believed it could be capable of. My theory is that if they could construct an array and a power grid capable of supporting the 100 gigawatts that he referred to, that would be capable of creating the massive microwave influence that Bernard referred to. That's complete speculation. I don't have any proof that they're going to do something or they are doing something like that. But in theory, I believe that Bernard's ideas have validity. I just don't think that there's any validity to being able to scale it up at this time. If they found a way, it would work. At least from what I read. That's what it seemed like. Thank you for watching Truth or Foil. I really tried to do my homework. I really tried to get the science down on this one and look at some of the more wild ideas involved. I think this is probably one of my favorite conspiracies that I've looked at so far. I learned a ton of stuff researching it. If you enjoy my content, please like, share, subscribe, and all of that supports the channel. If you heard my birds or my cat, sorry, they're noisy, nothing I can do about it. Besides, pay attention to them, this is what they want. And hopefully you like the editing and the lighting and all the changes I'm trying to make the and I'll see you next time on Truth or Foil.